What does a woman do when she is bound by a debt she never chose? Before the gathering was over, Dyani would name her own husband in front of everyone who had already decided her future for her, her own people and the settlers both, all of them certain they knew the outcome before she ever opened her mouth. Arizona Territory, 1886. A hard drought had turned an old debt into a bargain, and the bargain had turned a 19-year-old woman into the last coin in an empty purse. What Dyani was about to do would put her own camp at risk, put a target on the back of a quiet horsebreaker named Elias Reed, and force an entire valley to answer a question it had never once had to face out loud. Who does a woman belong to if not herself? Watch till the end to see how she stood down two peoples in a single afternoon, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next story. The trouble had begun 2 winters before, though nobody had thought of it as trouble at the time. It had begun, as most trouble in that country began, with weather. The rains that should have come in the summer of '84 never arrived at all, and the creek that fed both the Chiricahua camp in the foothills and the scattered cattle spreads below it had shrunk to a brown thread by the first snow. Dyani remembered that winter, the way a person remembers a fever, in pieces, the sound of her mother coughing through the cold nights, the taste of thin broth stretched too far, her Uncle Taji riding out at dawn and coming home after dark with his shoulders a little lower each time. Her father had died 2 summers earlier, thrown from a startled horse in a canyon that had claimed better riders than him. And it was Taji, her mother's brother, who had taken up the weight of the family after that, without ever once making it feel like a burden he resented. But even a good man runs out of what he can carry alone, and that winter with the corn gone and the herd thinned by cold and children coughing in every wickiup along the wash, Taji had done what a leader sometimes has to do. He had gone to the man who held the only full storehouse left in 50 miles and asked plainly to buy on credit. That man was Cyrus Wexler, and he had built his ranch the way certain men build empires in hard country, by being patient about other people's desperation. He was not, by the manner he wore in town, a cruel man. He smiled easily, paid his hands on time, and had once handed a wagon load of flour to a burned-out homestead family without a note in return. But Wexler's generosity was a ledger like everything else about him, and he kept careful track of who owed him what, and for how long, and at what rate the balance would grow if the borrower was slow to settle it. He had loaned Taji grain and rifles and 24 head of cattle, that terrible winter enough to carry the camp through to spring, and Taji had signed his mark to a paper he could not read in a language that was not his, trusting a spoken word because that was the only kind of promise his own people considered binding. It took 2 more dry years for the debt to grow past anything the camp could hope to repay in cattle or hides or labor, and it was in the spring of '86, with a 3rd bad season, bearing down and Wexler's patience finally running thin, that the rancher rode up to the camp himself and named the price he would accept in place of money. He wanted an alliance sealed in blood, though he dressed the idea up prettier than that. He wanted peace between his range and the camp guaranteed for a generation, and the surest way he knew to guarantee it was through marriage, his own foreman, a hard, capable man named Josiah Crane, to Taji's niece. The girl, the whole valley already knew by reputation for her way with horses, even if half of them had never troubled themselves to learn her name. In exchange, the debt would be forgiven entire, down to the last steer, and the camp would keep its water rights on the lower creek that Wexler's lawyer in Tucson had been quietly maneuvering to claim for 2 years running. It was, by the arithmetic of that country, an extraordinarily generous offer. It solved everything except the one thing it never once considered, which was whether the woman herself wanted any part of it. Dyani heard about the proposal secondhand, from her Aunt Yuppa, who found her at the creek where she had been gentling a young mare that flinched at everything, and needed patience more than a firm hand. Yuppa did not soften it. She had never softened hard things, believing correctly that a woman prepared for a blow bore it better than one taken by surprise. and she made plain to Dyani that the full council would meet in 10 days to settle the matter of the debt, and that Taji looked 10 years older every time the subject rose in council, and that if nothing changed between now and then, Dyani would very likely find herself married to a settler foreman she had exchanged perhaps 6 words with in her whole life, all 6 of them unpleasant. Dyani did not cry. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father's death, that tears rarely bought a person anything they actually needed, and what she needed now, more than tears, was time to think. She went back to the mare and kept working, her hands steady even while something in her chest had gone very cold and very still, the particular stillness of a person measuring exactly how much room she had left to move. She was 19 that spring, quick-handed and clear-eyed, known through the camp for a gift with horses that bordered on something the elders considered medicine, though Dyani herself thought it was mostly patience and paying attention. She had lost her mother to fever the winter before her father died, so that by 17 she had buried both parents and learned, without anyone teaching her directly, how a person keeps walking anyway. She wove baskets tight enough to hold water and stitched moccasins soft enough that the old women set her to work on theirs, and she carried herself, even in a bad year, with a quiet dignity that made people notice her, without quite being able to explain why. What she did not have and had never once in her 19 years imagined she might need was any legal standing to refuse a bargain her uncle and a rich rancher struck over her head like she was a length of good rope being divided between 2 outfits. That was the arithmetic she turned over at the creek that afternoon, working the mare's flinch out one slow stroke at a time. Not whether it was fair. She already knew it was not fair. The real question was, what, if anything, a woman with no standing at all could do about it? It was at that same creek 2 months earlier that she had first properly met the man whose name would end up tangled through the whole rest of the story, though on the morning it happened neither of them had any idea what they were starting. Elias Reed had ridden into that country the previous autumn with a string of green horses and a reputation already well earned by then for gentling an animal that other men had given up on and written off as worthless. He worked for no single outfit, hiring his skill out to whichever ranch needed it that season, which suited him fine, because it meant he answered to no man's temper for longer than a few weeks at a stretch. He was 28, quiet in the particular way of men who had seen enough of the world to stop needing to talk about it, and he had come west originally as an Army scout, a job he had walked away from after 2 years because he could no longer stomach the distance between what his commanders considered necessary and what his own conscience did. He rarely raised that history with anyone in the valley, not even much later, when there was reason to, but it left him with a habit that set him apart from nearly every other white man in that country, without him ever making a point of it. He treated the people of Taji's camp as people first, and as Apache second, by our rarer practice in that time and place than it should have been. The morning their paths crossed properly, a spring storm had spooked Taji's whole remuda loose from its rope corral, and a dozen horses had scattered across 3 miles of broken country before anyone could catch a saddle. Elias had been breaking colts for Wexler's outfit that week, close enough to hear the commotion, and he did the thing that a certain kind of man in that country simply did not do. He set his own work aside and spent the better part of a day running down another outfit's stray stock for no payment and no thanks expected. He brought back 9 of the 12 himself, roped and led gentle so as not to lame them further, and delivered them to the camp at dusk, with his hat off and his manner so plain and unassuming that it took Taji a full minute of studying him to be sure the man wasn't working some angle. He wasn't. He explained only that a scattered horse was a scattered horse regardless of whose rope it wore, and that he'd want the same done for him, then turned to go before anyone could properly thank him. Dyani stopped him, mostly because the last of the missing 3 horses was the young mare she had been working for a month, and she had watched from the ridge as Elias brought the 9 others in and marked, with the particular attention she gave anything involving horses, the exact gentleness of his hands on the lead ropes. She wanted to know, in the careful English she had picked up from 3 years at the mission school before her mother pulled her out of it, whether he'd seen a bay filly with a white sock on the near hind he had. He'd spotted her tangled in brush a mile back, but had not wanted to force a green frightened animal any further without help, and he suggested, plain as passing the salt, that they ride out together and get the filly loose. It took them the better part of 2 hours, working in a silence that turned out to be comfortable rather than awkward, Dyani reading the mare's fear and Elias reading Dyani's signals without needing them explained, and by the time they walked the filly back into camp on a loose lead, something had shifted between them that neither one named at the time, because neither one yet had a reason to. What grew after that was not swift, and it was not showy, and it was all the more solid for being neither. Elias took to bringing his hardest, most troubled horses to the flat ground near the creek, where Dyani liked to work, not requesting permission exactly, but never assuming it either, always waiting for some small sign from her that the company was welcome before he unsaddled. He learned, slowly and with visible effort, a handful of words in her language, enough to greet Taji properly and thank Yappa for the coffee she pressed on him more out of suspicion than hospitality at first. Dyani in turn began teaching him things about horses no army post had ever bothered to teach a scout. How to read the set of an ear before the ear finished moving. How a horse that had been beaten carried its head different from a horse that had only ever been startled. Small distinctions that made the difference between gentling an animal and merely breaking it. He never once, in all those months, spoke of her the way some of the ranch hands did about Apache women, when they assumed no one Apache could hear them, and on the 2 occasions he did overhear it in the mercantile at the little settlement below the ranch, he had a way of emptying the room of their laughter. The second of those 2 mercantile mornings happened to be one. Dyani witnessed herself having ridden down with Yipa to trade a basket of good weaving for coffee and cloth, and it was the day she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever this was between her and the quiet horsebreaker had already grown into something she was not prepared to let go of easily. 2 of Wexler's younger hands had been leaning against the counter, making loud sport of a woman who had just left an older Apache widow trading turquoise for flour, their comments meant to be overheard and enjoyed by anyone white enough to laugh along. Elias, who had been standing at the far end buying rope, set the coil down slow and walked the length of the counter, and whatever he put to those 2 men was quiet enough that Dyani, standing near the door, caught only the shape of it and none of the exact words, but it was enough. Both men went red and silent and found urgent business elsewhere within the minute. Elias never looked for thanks afterward. He simply went back to his rope as though nothing had happened at all, and it was that, the fact that he expected nothing in return for doing the plain right thing, that revealed more about his character than any speech could have. She never mistook what was growing between them for rescue, and this mattered to her more than she could easily have explained to anyone who had not lived her particular life. She had watched from a careful distance other women in other camps taken up by well-meaning white men who treated the taking up itself as the whole of the kindness, as though a woman's gratitude were owed simply for being noticed, and she wanted no part of a bond built on that arithmetic. What she found in Elias instead was a man who seemed to understand, without her ever needing to spell it out, that she was not a project, or a cause, or a curiosity, but a person entirely capable of running her own life, who happened, in this particular case, to value his company. He asked her opinion on horses he was training, as though her answer might genuinely change his mind, which it often did. He never once volunteered to teach her about her own land or her own people, having the sense rare in a man of his background to understand that she likely knew both a great deal better than he did. And when, late that winter, he finally shared the piece of his own history he had shared with no one else in the valley, that he had left the army after watching a commanding officer order the burning of a rancheria that held no warriors, only families, and that he had ridden away that same night and never once looked back. He handed it over, not as a bid for her sympathy, but as an honest accounting of who he was, given plainly because he trusted her enough to be seen without polish. If stories researched this deeply are worth your time, become a channel member. Just tap the small join button beside our channel name. It takes a moment, and it keeps tales like Dyani's coming every week. By the time the drought entered its third year and Wexler's proposal landed in the camp like a stone dropped in still water, Dyani and Elias had built between them nearly a full year of quiet, unhurried trust, the kind that does not announce itself with declarations but simply becomes, one ordinary morning at a time, the steadiest thing in a person's week. Neither of them had yet raised the subject of marriage, in part because the gap between them, a Chiricahua woman and a wandering white horse breaker with no land of his own, seemed in the practical light of that country and that year wide enough that neither wanted to name a hope circumstance might never allow to grow. But when Yepa laid out for her, at the creek, the exact shape of the bargain the council would soon weigh, Dyani's first clear thought, underneath the fear, was not of Josiah Crane's face or Wexler's ledger. It was of Elias, and of the particular unfairness of a world that would hand her to a stranger who had never once wondered what horse she rode or what she thought about anything, while the man who had spent a year valuing her opinion on everything that mattered had no legal standing to object at all. Josiah Crane, for his part, had made his own intentions plain enough that spring, though never once to Dyani directly, since it apparently had not occurred to him that her opinion on the matter required consulting. He was a capable foreman by any rancher's measure, hard-driving and efficient, the kind of man Wexler valued precisely because he never let sentiment slow a job down. He was also, in ways the whole valley had quietly registered over several seasons, a man who treated anything under his authority. Horses, hands, and by extension, apparently, prospective wives, as instruments to be used well or used up as the work required. He had ruined more than one good horse past the point of gentling because he had no patience for a slow lesson when a hard one would do faster, and Dyani, who judged men the way she judged horses, by how they behaved toward creatures who could not fight back, had marked him as dangerous the first season she watched him work a green colt into a lathered, terrified wreck in under an hour. That Wexler intended to hand her a living woman with a mind and a history and a will entirely her own, into that same man's keeping as a kind of peace bond, laid bare exactly how little either man had ever bothered to consider her a person capable of being harmed by the arrangement rather than merely improved by it, made safe and useful by it, the way a wild filly is made useful by a hard enough hand. Taji called for the full council on the 10th day after Wexler's visit, as was proper, giving the camp time to gather from its scattered spring grazing grounds, and giving the elders time to weigh the matter through in the slow, careful way real decisions were supposed to be reached among her people. Dyani used those 10 days as best she knew how. She rode out twice to find Elias at whatever ranch had hired him that week, and on both occasions she made plain what was coming, watching his jaw tighten and his hands go still on whatever rope or tack he was working, watching him take in the news the way a man absorbs a blow he has no right to complain about because it is not strictly his blow to carry. He did not, on either visit, propose to fix it for her. He wanted to know instead what she intended to do, and when she answered honestly that she did not yet know, only that she would not stand mute while two men settled the rest of her life over her head, he made clear that whatever she decided, she would not be facing it alone, and left it there, understanding correctly that a promise to stand beside her carried more weight in that moment than any promise to save her. She spent the rest of those 10 days doing something else too, something that mattered a great deal more to how the story would end than anyone at the time understood. She went quietly and without letting even Yepa in on her intention to sit with grandmother Sana. Sana was the oldest woman in the camp by a wide margin, a medicine woman respected by every generation living, the kind of elder whose opinion, once given, could turn a council even against a chief's own preference. Dyani found her working hides outside her wickiup on a warm afternoon, and sat with her a long while before she finally put the question she had come to put, which was whether it was true, as she believed she had been taught as a girl, that among their people a marriage had never in the old way been considered sealed until the woman herself gave her own word to it freely. Santa did not answer quickly. She worked the hide a while longer, her hands slow and certain with age, and then she walked Dyani through a memory of her own grandmother's time, before the army and the reservations, and the long years of being pressed into smaller and smaller corners of their own country, when a man might approach a woman's family for her, and gifts might change hands, and elders might counsel and hope and even lean hard on a matter. But the final word, always, without exception, belonged to the woman herself, because a marriage built on anything less was no marriage at all in the true meaning of the thing. What had crept in since, Sana went on, the growing habit of fathers and uncles and chiefs treating their word alone as sufficient to settle a daughter's future, had drifted in slow, borrowed without anyone quite noticing, from the hard, desperate bargains their people had been forced into across 2 generations of broken treaties and starving winters, until some among them had half forgotten it was never truly their own way to begin with. Dyani sat with that a long while after Sana finished, and when she finally rode back to her own fire that evening, she understood with a settling certainty that felt less like a decision and more like a remembering exactly what she intended to do at the council in 6 days' time. The gathering itself convened at midday on a bright, wind-scoured spring afternoon, at the flat meeting ground between the camp and the lower creek where such matters were traditionally settled, chosen deliberately. Dyani suspected Dop because it sat close enough to the boundary that Wexler and a handful of his men could attend without technically trespassing on land that was not theirs. Nearly the whole camp turned out, since a council concerning the camp's largest outstanding debt was everyone's business, and word had traveled far enough down the valley that a small cluster of settlers came too, drawn by curiosity and in a few honest cases, genuine concern for how the matter would resolve. Wexler arrived in his good coat with Josiah Crane riding a pace behind him, both men wearing the particular ease of men who consider an outcome already settled and have come merely to watch the formalities catch up to the fact of it. Elias came too, though he stood well back at the edge of the gathering rather than near the settlers' cluster, understanding without needing anyone to say so that his place that day was to be present and visible, not to insert himself into a decision belonging, by every right that mattered to Dyani and her own people. Taji rose first, as was proper, laying out the debt in careful, honest terms before the whole assembly, the grain, the rifles, the cattle, the 3 dry years that had made repayment impossible by any ordinary means, and it cost him something visible to do it. The admission of a burden he had carried alone for 2 years, finally set plain in front of everyone he was responsible for. Wexler followed, smooth and reasonable in the manner of a man who has rehearsed generosity until it sounds like simple decency, laying out the terms of the marriage bargain as though he were describing a fair trade of horses, rather than the disposal of a living woman's future, and more than one elder in the circle nodded slowly as he went on, weighing the water rights and the forgiven debt against the hunger the camp had already survived, and might yet survive again if the drought did not break. It was, Dyani could see plainly, even through her own fear, a genuinely difficult question for her people, not a simple villainy to be shouted down, and that difficulty was exactly why she had known, these 10 days past, that the answer could not be left to the council alone. It had to come from her. She rose before Taji had finished calling for the elders' council, which was itself enough of a break from custom that a ripple of surprise moved audibly through the circle. She did not raise her voice. She had thought a great deal in the quiet hours of the preceding days about exactly how she wanted to frame what she was about to put before them, and she gave it now in a register pitched to carry to every corner of the gathering without needing to rise above level, because she had learned from watching Santa and every capable elder in her life, the true authority rarely needs volume to be heard. She thanked her uncle for the burden he had carried these 3 years on behalf of a family and a camp that could never fully repay what it had cost him. And she made clear she understood, better than anyone standing there, exactly how much the forgiveness of that debt would mean for every child who would otherwise go hungry again this winter. And then she made her own terms plain, that she would not be bought as the price of it, not because she did not love her people, but because she loved them enough to refuse to let their survival be purchased with a lie about what marriage among them had always truly meant. She turned then to Grandmother Sana, who had been waiting. Dyani understood only in that moment for exactly this cue, and asked her to lay before the whole gathering what she had shared with Dyani 6 days before, at her own fire. Sana rose slowly, with the unhurried authority of a woman nobody in that circle would dare interrupt, and set it out plainly, that a marriage among their people had never, in the true and oldest way of it, been sealed by any word but the woman's own, and that whatever borrowed habit of silence had crept in around that truth, in the hard years since the treaties, it was a habit worth breaking, not a law worth keeping. Several of the older women in the circle voiced agreement before Sana had even finished, a quiet chorus of remembering that moved through the gathering like wind through grass, and Dyani watched Taji's shoulders, which had been bowed under 2 years of unspoken debt, straighten by a visible degree as though some of that weight had just lifted from him too. Not merely from her. Dyani turned next to face Wexler and Josiah Crane directly, and it was here, in front of both her own people and the men who had assumed the outcome settled before they ever arrived, that she gave the words that carried the story the rest of its distance. She would not marry a stranger to settle a debt that was never hers, she made plain, and a marriage entered into out of fear of hunger was no gift to anyone, least of all to the man receiving an unwilling wife. And then because she had decided in those same 6 quiet days that if her people's own true custom gave her the right to refuse, that same custom gave her equally the right to choose, she turned and found Elias standing at the edge of the gathering and named him plainly in front of everyone as the man she would take for herself. Not because he had rescued her, she made clear, for he never had, but because in a full year of knowing him, he had never once wanted her to be anything other than exactly who she already was. The uproar that followed came fast and considerable, though it broke tellingly along lines that had nothing to do with tribe or race, and everything to do with who in that gathering had actually paid attention to the last year of Dyani's life and who had not. A number of the settlers standing near Wexler laughed outright, assuming the whole declaration some kind of defiance without teeth, until they read Wexler's face and understood it was neither. Josiah Crane went the color of a man struck who was deciding whether to strike back, his hand drifting, for one bad second, toward his belt before some scrap of remaining sense stopped it there. Wexler himself gave no answer at first, only stared at Dyani with the particular blankness of a man recalculating a ledger that had just refused to balance the way he had counted on, and it was that silence, more than any noise, that revealed exactly how badly his plan had come apart. It was Wexler who found words first once the crowd settled, and what he put forward was simple and cold and entirely in keeping with the kind of man he had proven himself underneath the pleasant manner. The debt, he made clear, stood as it always had, and if the camp would not settle it his way, it would settle it in cattle and land, immediately and full, with the Lower Creek water rights passing to him by the terms of the original note, whether Taji liked the arithmetic of it or not. He gave the council 3 days, and then, turning his cold attention on Elias, who had come forward at last from the edge of the gathering to stand beside Dyani without a word, Wexler let drop something quieter, meant only for the men close enough to hear it, that a horsebreaker who couldn't keep his hands off another man's arrangement might find hiring work considerably harder to come by in that valley from that day forward, and that a man who made an enemy of Cyrus Wexler over a woman he had no legal claim to had made a poor trade indeed. Josiah Crane, for his part, offered nothing in reply, only stared at Elias with an expression that promised the matter was not, in his own private accounting, finished. The 3 days that followed were the hardest of the whole business, harder in their way than the gathering itself, because a threat delivered aloud in daylight is at least a threat a person can see coming, and what came next came mostly in shadow. Elias lost 2 days of hired work within 24 hours, both ranchers suddenly and vaguely, unable to use him after years of steady employment, the kind of quiet economic strangulation a man like Wexler could accomplish across an entire valley without ever once dirtying his own hands with it directly. On the second night, riding back alone from the settlement to the line shack where he had been staying, Elias was set upon by 3 riders in the dark who worked him over with fists and a coiled rope rather than guns, professional enough about it that he understood immediately this was meant as a warning rather than a killing. Delivered with the particular message, put to him low by one of the men before they rode off and left him in the dirt, that the next visit would not be so gentle if he had not made himself scarce from that valley by week's end. He did not, when Dyani found him the next morning bruised and stiff but upright, let on at first how bad it had truly been, and it was only when she pulled his shirt back from a wound on his ribs that had gone the wrong color overnight that the full shape of it came clear to her. She wanted, in that first hot rush of fear and fury, to ride straight to Wexler's ranch herself, and it took every ounce of the steadiness she had spent 19 hard years building to instead sit with her anger and turn it deliberately into something more useful than a single reckless ride could accomplish. She had learned, from watching her uncle carry an impossible debt for 2 years without ever once losing his own dignity in the carrying of it, that the strongest response to a man like Wexler was rarely the loudest one. What she needed now was not rage. It was allies and a plan, and the particular kind of courage that shows itself not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a series of small, deliberate choices made one after another under pressure. If you believe an honest, well-researched Western love story is worth supporting, tap the join button beside our channel name and become a member. It costs little, and it keeps these long, true-to-history tales alive week after week. She went first to Taji, and together they went to the council a full day before Wexler's 3-day deadline expired, because Dyani had understood something in the hours since the attack that she had not fully grasped before, that the debt Wexler was demanding be paid in cattle and land, immediate and in full, was a debt the camp genuinely could not meet without gutting itself for another winter, and that Wexler was counting precisely on that impossibility to force either her marriage or the camp's ruin, whichever came first. What the camp could not meet in cattle, though it might be able to answer in a different currency entirely, and it was Sana again who put forward the shape of it, reminding the council that Wexler's original loan, however inflated by 3 years of compounding, had begun as a specific, countable thing, not the open-ended claim on water and land his lawyer had since dressed it up to be. If the council could gather even a portion of that original count in cattle from across the camp's scattered herds, and if Elias, who after a year of steady work in that valley had put by savings of his own from breaking horses for 6 different outfits, could put the rest toward it as a loan against his own future earnings, rather than a gift that would compromise Dyani's standing, the two sums together might come close enough to the honest original debt that even a hostile lawyer in Tucson would struggle to argue Wexler had not, in fact, been made whole. It was not a plan built on a single grand gesture. No gunfight, no last-minute fortune discovered in a hidden claim, and that was rather the point of it. It was a plan built the way Dyani had watched her people survive 3 dry years, one careful, unglamorous decision compounding on the next, and when she rode out to lay the shape of it before Elias, he agreed without a single moment's hesitation, understanding plainly that whatever future he had pictured for himself before that year mattered less to him now than standing beside the woman who had chosen him in front of 2 peoples rather than simply waiting to be his rescue. He wanted to know, once, gently, whether she was certain she wished to tie her own hard-won freedom to a debt owed on his behalf as well as her camp's, and she made clear, with the same steady clarity she had carried at the gathering, that a debt shared freely between two people who trusted each other was an entirely different thing from a debt one person was handed without her consent, and that she meant, from this point forward, to make that distinction the whole shape of her life. Word of what the camp intended reached Wexler before the council formally presented it, as such things generally did in a valley small enough that little moved unseen, and it reached Josiah Crane first, and hardest, because Crane understood something Wexler, in his cold arithmetic, had perhaps underestimated, that the humiliation of being publicly refused in front of two peoples was not a debt any repayment plan could settle, and that no arrangement in the world would undo the fact that everyone in that valley now knew Dyani had looked at him and chosen someone else. It was Crane, not Wexler, who rode out alone to the line shack on the fourth night, past the council's deadline, and past whatever cold business calculation his employer might still have been running, carrying a grievance that had stopped, somewhere in those few days, being about money at all. Elias was not alone that night, having taken to keeping a lantern burning and a rifle within reach ever since the first attack, and Dyani, against every argument he had made for her own safety, had refused to be sent back to camp before dark, understanding correctly that two watchful people were a good deal harder to catch off guard than one exhausted one. She caught the sound of Crane's horse before Elias did, the particular hard, angry rhythm of a man riding without much care for his mount's footing in the dark, and she had the presence of mind to snuff the lantern and pull Elias back from the doorway a full 10 seconds before Crane's shape filled the paler dark of the open door, rifle already half raised. What happened next was neither a gunfight nor a rescue in any way a dime novel would have staged it, and that too was rather the point. Dyani stepped forward into the faint moonlight before Elias could move to put himself between her and the rifle, understanding with cold clarity that Crane's fury aimed, in its truest shape, at her refusal rather than at Elias's existence, and that the surest way to diffuse a man consumed by wounded pride was rarely to give him a fight to win, but to take the fight away from him entirely by refusing to flinch. She let him know in a voice she kept as level as she had kept it at the gathering, that shooting a horsebreaker in the dark over a debt already being honestly repaid would not undo her choice, would only make him a murderer as well as a jilted man, and that every person in that valley, settler and Apache both, would know exactly what he had done and why, for the rest of his life in that country. Crane held the rifle raised a long moment, his breathing ragged, and it was not Dyani's words alone that finally broke the standoff, but the sound, cutting through the dark a moment later, of riders approaching from the direction of the camp, Taji and 3 other men, alerted by a runner Dyani had quietly sent ahead the instant she heard the horse. Arriving not to fight Crane, but simply to stand present, to make plain that whatever happened at that line shack would happen in front of witnesses from both peoples rather than in the private dark where Wexler's earlier warning had done its work unseen. Crane lowered the rifle. Whatever else could be claimed of him, he was not, in the end, a man willing to commit murder in front of 4 witnesses over a grievance he could not fully justify even to himself, and he rode off into the dark without another word, though it was plain to everyone present that his humiliation. He left Wexler's employ within the month. The story went around the valley afterward, unable to stomach staying in a place where every man who had ridden out that night knew exactly what he had nearly done and why he had not finished doing it. Wexler himself faced 3 days later with a council delegation, presenting the original debt's honest count in cattle plus Elias's savings toward the balance, and faced too with the plain fact that the whole valley now knew the details of both his original inflated claim and his foreman's midnight ride. Joe's the path men like him generally choose. When a scheme collapses in public, he accepted the payment, considered the debt settled in a voice that pretended he had intended exactly this outcome all along, and quietly let the matter of the water rights drop rather than risk a lawyer's scrutiny of a note that would not survive close examination in front of witnesses who had heard him name its original terms himself at the gathering. It was not, Dyani reflected afterward, a triumphant ending in the way a story often promises one. No dramatic downfall, no final reckoning delivered in a blaze of gunfire. It was simply the quieter, more durable kind of victory that comes when a lie is made to stand in daylight, next to the truth it depended on staying hidden, and cannot hold its shape any longer. There was, in the weeks that followed the debt settling, a season of small repairs that mattered nearly as much to Dyani as the confrontation itself, though it made for a far quieter chapter of the story. Taji walked through the camp differently, his voice steadier in counsel, and more than one elder who had nodded along with Wexler's proposal that spring came privately to Dyani afterward to acknowledge in their own way that they had let fear of a hard winter crowd out a truth they had known all along. Sana took to inviting Dyani to sit with her most evenings that summer, not to teach her anything new so much as to pass along, piece by piece, the accumulated memory of 100 small customs that had nearly slipped away in 2 generations of hardship. Understanding that a young woman who had reclaimed one piece of the old way might be trusted to carry the rest of it forward as well. Even Blankia, who had never in her life softened a hard truth for anyone, began that summer to speak of Elias without the guarded suspicion she had carried toward him for a year, admitting once, gruffly over coffee, that a man willing to hand over his own savings for a woman's freedom rather than her hand had earned more trust than most men managed in a lifetime of trying. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was neither entirely her people's way nor entirely the settlers', but something Dyani and Elias built deliberately from pieces of both. Understanding that a marriage begun in the act of choosing rather than being chosen, Sana blessed the union at a fire the evening before, working through the old words in the old way, and the next morning a circuit preacher passing through the valley on other business agreed, at Elias's quiet request, to add a few words of his own tradition as well, so that neither side of the marriage would ever feel pressured to disappear into the other. Taji walked Dyani the last stretch to where Elias waited, his shoulders straight now, in a way they had not been in 3 long years, the debt gone and something heavier than the debt gone with it. Yuppa cried, having sworn for 2 years that she never would over anything, and pretended afterward that the wind alone had been unkind to her eyes. Elias, for his part, spent that whole first year of marriage doing exactly what he had always done, asking Dyani's opinion before his own on matters concerning them both, deferring to her judgment on horses and household and camp business alike, never once treating the marriage itself as a settled achievement that excused him from the ongoing, unglamorous work of earning her continued trust. He built her a small house of her own design, near the creek where they had first met, close enough to camp that Yepa and Sana could visit easily, and close enough to the settlement that his horse-breaking work never went short of buyers, a home that belonged fully to neither world and fully to both. Their first daughter, born the following spring, grew up hearing both languages from the cradle and both grandmother's stories by the fire, and Dyani made certain, every single time the story of the gathering came up in front of her, that the child understood the true shape of what had happened there, not that a cowboy had rescued a helpless girl, but that a girl with no legal standing at all had built herself some out of an old truth nearly forgotten, and that the cowboy had simply been fortunate enough and decent enough to be worth choosing when she did. What the whole valley took from the story, in the retelling that spread through that country for years afterward, was not, in the end, a tale about a cowboy who saved an Apache woman from a bad arrangement, however tempting that simpler shape might have been to settle into. It was a story recounted most often by the women who circulated it around their own fires, about a woman handed no legal standing at all who built herself some, anyway, out of an old truth nearly slipping away, and the plain courage to voice it in front of people. Elias never once, in all the years that followed, described himself as the man who rescued her understanding correctly and making the point himself whenever the shorthand version got passed along wrong in front of him, that he had simply been fortunate enough to be standing nearby, worth choosing, when a woman decided to save herself. Dyani lived the rest of her long life in that valley, her herd of horses eventually known across 3 counties for the same gentle, patient handling that had first drawn a quiet horsebreaker to her side of the creek. One ordinary spring morning, and she passed on to her own children and grandchildren whenever the story rose again. That the moment she was proudest of in her whole life was not the wedding, and not even the choosing of Elias, but the 6 quiet days beforehand. Sitting with an old woman outside a wickiup, remembering a truth her people had nearly let slip away, and deciding, plainly and without permission from anyone, to hand it back to herself. If this story of a woman who refused to be bought moved you the way it moved us to research and tell it, give it a like, subscribe for more true to history Wild West love stories every week, and we will see you in the next one.